Steve Rattner, Willett Advisors Chairman and CEO, sat down with Bloomberg's David Westin to discuss the United Auto Workers complaint filed against several large U.S. automakers. Take a listen.
This is really a scary situation. We've had many labor negotiations between the auto workers and the UAW over the decades. We've had some strikes, unfortunately, but some of them probably were inevitable or even perhaps necessary. This situation is really scary for a number of reasons. First, you have a very activist new UAW leader who I do not know personally, but who has said very inflammatory things. Didn't do the traditional GM or auto worker initial handshake, which is just symbolic. He doesn't have to do that, but more importantly, has put out a set of demands publicly, which is unusual in itself, that are an utter laundry list. From everything from a 32-hour week to a 4-hour week to more holidays to more job restrictions to restoration of defined benefit pensions, just a long list of stuff that is just beyond the pale in terms of any auto company's ability to meet it.
Now, one of the things that Shawn Fain, and I guess his name of the head of the UAW, has said is they need to make up for some lost time. There has been a lot of inflation, as we know. They were operating under a labor contract that really didn't allow that inflation to be taken into account. Can you separate out what is truly making up for lost time, catching up with where they should be, maybe advancing a bit, as opposed to fundamentally changing the business model for the auto companies?
Well, I think that when you talk about asking for pay increases, and they've asked for very large pay increases as well, that sort of falls into the making up for lost time category. Although I would acknowledge that, or I would note that they did get fairly substantial profit sharing bonuses as a result of the auto companies being more profitable. They have had wage increases and so on. So it's not like they took massive pay cuts in recent years during this inflationary period. But the bigger thing of concern to me is everything around the actual pay level. And it includes things like the number of hours worked, when overtime kicks in, how many holidays you get, how many personal days off you get, things like that. But here's, David, the thing that is the scariest of all to me, which is work rules. I am a great believer in unions. I'm a great believer in the right and the ability of unions to bargain for higher compensation and for certain kinds of other benefits, healthcare, things like that, that we all know are important now for workers to have. But when you start talking about work rules, then you start cutting into productivity. And then we start going down a slippery slope we've been down before with bad effects. When we got involved with the auto sector, and in General Motors in particular, I remember, there was something like 300 job classifications at General Motors. If you were an electrician, you couldn't touch a piece of plumbing. If you were a truck guy, you couldn't do something else, and so on and so forth. And it makes for a highly inefficient production process and works to the detriment ultimately of everybody. And the unions have come back now and asked for the reinstitution of some, happily not all, of the kinds of work rules that we had before 2009. And that kind of rolling back of this sort of wholesale rolling back of the clock is a very dangerous place to be. So, but let me say one other thing. In terms of all of these wage settlements and negotiations that you see going on, whether it's UPS, whether it's the auto industry, whether it's whatever, you have to really separate in a way, and I know this doesn't sound necessarily completely fair, but you have to separate the so-called tradable sectors from the non-tradable sectors like services. Paying the UPS workers more absolutely contributes to inflation. It affects every American who ships something by UPS and obviously benefits the UPS workers. Doing something similar in a tradable sector, by which we generally mean goods that can be traded across borders, you do run into international competitive issues. And this was part of what ailed the industry back in 2009. The yin and the yang of this is if you raise wages too much, then production will flow somewhere else, most notably to Mexico, which has had a disproportionate share of production increases in the last 15 years. Or it will flow from the north, from the unionized plants in the north to the non-unionized plants in the south that are operated by a lot of the foreign companies that are coming here. And that does save jobs in America, but they're much less remunerative jobs. And they're located in places in the country that perhaps don't even need the jobs as much. So there's a lot of complexities to what is a fair and appropriate level of wages once you start getting into these tradable sectors.
Steve, as you lay out, there's a dynamic in this negotiation, a lot of concern about whether they can actually bridge the gap. But this all comes against a backdrop of larger changes afoot in the electric vehicles. And that's showing up, as I understand it, already in some of, for example, the battery plants with some joint ventures where I think the UAW is saying, wait a second, they should all be subject to UAW as well. How big a problem is that as the auto industry looks, both workers and employers look forward to a very different world with electric vehicles?
Yeah, that's definitely a complicating factor. Electric car plants, electric cars in general, require many few man hours of labor to make, as I'm sure you know, fewer moving parts and so forth. And so in the long run, it does raise the question of the level and extent of auto jobs that we're going to need in this country or anywhere else for that matter. It's not all going to be done by robots, don't get me wrong, but is there going to be some cap or some lessening of the number of jobs we need?